share my knowledge and my experiences about Titanium with you all. Currently, I'm working for a company called Nudesic. It's a consulting company, that has a national presence. So just a little shout out for them. What I want to do here is just talk a little bit and have a few slides about just kind of mobile in general. I like to kind of do this just to kind of put Titanium in the right scope. Because you can talk about Titanium or you can talk about different mobile tools, but without kind of, having a level set, time just to kind of like show this is mobile in general and this is how Titanium fits, within mobile in general. I just think that makes a lot more sense. So let's just talk about mobile in general a little bit. Consumers love using mobile devices and giving them access to data on the go. I think with consumers, it kind of showed that, people in general are okay with, using a mobile device. They're okay with, things like an app store concept and just being able to go out, find an app that they like, download it and use it. And we've seen that, that's a use case that people are okay with and not only are okay with, but they really like it. Just from a consumer point of view, when you're out there, and you need an app, let's say you want to find out where to go to dinner, you can download a mobile app, install it and use it right away, usually just within a few minutes. Wireless broadband is generally available where users need it. Just a few years ago, it was, kind of tough to get a good connection, from a mobile phone, the lack of, good, bandwidth in mobility was kind of a hurdle. But now with, 4G, LTE, a lot of different technologies, the lack of bandwidth isn't really a problem anymore. Like I was saying, users are okay with downloading apps, from an app store or, some kind of central repository. With the advent of, bring your own devices to work, employees are starting to use their own devices at work. So maybe for the first time, employers are, faced with a situation where, okay, my employees have devices, that they're using already that we can maybe take advantage of from an enterprise point of view, which is kind of a good thing for the companies. Before they'd have to, say, all right, if you're going to do, work for the company with a mobile device, we're going to have to buy mobile devices for everybody and, and give them out. And so this is kind of a good situation for the companies too. And, companies are always looking for ways to make their employees, more productive. And with mobile, being, so popular now, mobile is a great way to, enable, employees of companies, by pushing out some corporate data and, in an easy to use and secure manner. Right, so enterprise. So we've seen kind of how consumers are latching onto mobile, so enterprise, is going to be kind of following that same pattern where employees are, employees of a company are going to be starting to use, this new mobile technology to make their, lives and jobs easier. So consumers kind of kick-started that mobile revolution, but now enterprises are certainly, jumping on the bandwagon too. And a lot of enterprises have, some kind of Microsoft technology. So that's kind of a common platform that can be used to leverage to push out, some data to mobile devices. Especially in an enterprise, mobile devices are only as good as the data that they expose. So having kind of a common repository for that data makes it a little easier to come up with adapters and services to, get that data out there. And, just in general, mobile devices, JSON is a great way to, send out data. For anyone who might not know, JSON just stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is just it's just native JavaScript, formats, arrays, and objects. So it's very easy for, JavaScript-based, mobile apps to consume this data. So it's easy for servers to push it out, and it's easy for mobile devices and mobile apps to consume. So it's just a great way to, share that data. App distribution, right. Titanium makes it easy to get into Apple's App Store. Some of the details about icons, plist entries are handled automatically by Titanium Studio. A lot of times when you're trying to get an app in the App Store for the first time, you go through a validation step and, you get a response back saying, well, the icons aren't in the right, dimensions, they're not the right file name, this plist entry needs to be there. So Titanium Studio is nice that once you develop your application, it makes it easier to get it into the App Store because it kind of deals with a lot of those nitty-gritty details, for you. iPhone, Apple allows enterprise distribution. This is a really nice thing, especially for enterprises that are thinking about, jumping onto the mobile bandwagon or already have, in that when you put an app in the App Store, you're subject to Apple's, what they say you can and can't do with an app. So maybe you're trying to do something that might be kind of a neat functionality for an app to have, or something that an enterprise might want to have in their app, but if it violates any of Apple's rules, then they're not going to allow it in the App Store. So that's why enterprise distribution is nice, because you can do anything you want in the app. You can, have any kind of functionality that you want. And then Titanium Studio makes it easy to compile out your app, for enterprise distribution. You basically just, give it the enterprise distribution certificate, give it a little bit of information, and then it can compile out the IPA and the plist entries that you need just to, then you can basically put it on a web server and distribute it very easily to your employees. So enterprise distribution offers a lot of value, to enterprises, and Titanium Studio makes it really easy to take advantage of enterprise distribution. On the, Android front, right, most Android, apps in general aren't subject to a lot of, rules and regulations. So it's a little easier for Android. I mean, you basically have the same approach in that with Titanium Studio, you create the, Android APK. That's just the binary executable. And again, then you can just put that on a web server, email a link out to your users, and then they can just basically go to that link and, download and install that app. So Titanium just makes it very easy to, package up mobile apps in a format, for distributing out to your employees. Right, so what we're seeing is that, people/employees love using mobile devices. It's an environment that people like. So enterprises and just, companies in general that, want to push out an app to users, just mobile devices is a proven way that people like using. Companies now see the value in having internal and external apps for their customers or employees, and Titanium Studio just makes it easy to develop apps, for both fronts. If you're looking to, build an app, that's more consumer-based, and you're willing to, live within the regulations of the App Store, then Titanium Studio makes it easy, to go that way. If you're developing apps, for internal employees of an enterprise, and then Titanium Studio makes it easy to, produce apps for iOS and Android, kind of in that context. Right, and it's just, using Titanium Studio and kind of mobile in general gives you a real nice way to kind of, segment, functionality. You can have some people working in Titanium Studio developing the mobile apps, and then maybe you've got some, .NET resources that, can build up some of the web services, to help expose some of the data. So it's just a great way to, help reuse some internal resources of companies. Making a mobile app. All right, so now here are a few different ways of making a mobile app, and just kind of show you where Titanium fits within that, and some of the advantages Titanium Studio brings to bear. But just making a mobile app in general, there's a few different ways of doing it. You can do it 100% native, using tools for a specific platform, like Xcode or Android's, SDK. Using Objective-C, for iOS, using Java for Android, BlackBerry. But when you're going down this route, you're basically using, the tools, supplied, by the, by the manufacturer of the OS. So like I was saying, it would be Xcode for iOS, and Java-based tools for Android. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. 100% web, that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. Let's say you don't want to worry about native, functionality at all. You just want to, use some of your in-house JavaScript, coders, reuse some of that skill set, but still get an quote-unquote app out there for people to use, that's maybe a little more of a path of least resistance. But on that end of the spectrum, you're just using web technologies, using JavaScript, CSS3, HTML5, using that kind of skill set, that platform to, develop just a 100% web-based mobile app. Then there's a hybrid approach. This is with a product, called PhoneGap. It's also known as Cordova since Adobe acquired them. But it uses an embedded web view. It still uses the same HTML5, JavaScript, CSS3 kind of, skill set that 100% web would use, but it basically takes that mobile app, wraps it up into an app wrapper, and that way you can get it into the App Store. That way you can get it into Google's, Play. And it just gives you access to some of the native functionality, that you might not have access to when you're going the 100% web route. But this just kind of gets you a little closer to the native functionality, a little closer to, some of, the advantages you'd have going native, but still, lets you use some of that JavaScript skill set you might have in-house. Now, another way of doing it is what I like to call native assist. I mean, sometimes people will call this hybrid, but I don't really like to call it hybrid because then people think of PhoneGap and Cordova. But with native assist, I like to call it native assist because you're still developing a native app, but you're not using, tools provided, by the, manufacturer of the OS. So you're still building a 100% native iOS app and Android app, but you're not directly using Xcode and, all the Java-based tools. So this category is for things like Titanium, Monotouch, which uses non-native languages, but it still produces a 100% native app. So this is kind of the best of both worlds, and that a lot of times people will go 100% web just to kind of reuse some internal skill set and get something up and running a little more quickly. But then you have to use, CSS and some JavaScript to kind of reproduce UI controls. With things like Titanium, that allows you to use JavaScript, get an app up and running pretty quickly using your existing knowledge of JavaScript, but then it still produces a native app that uses native UI controls and just gives everyone a better user experience. Yeah, hopefully this isn't too much of an eye chart, but this is just a chart that is trying to convey, the way you develop an app, you kind of have to balance how many different platforms am I going to be able to run across with basically the same code base, and what kind of a user experience and what kind of user experience am I going to get. So at the very bottom, we're seeing things like HTML4, which is, what you'd use to develop, develop using your existing web skills, your existing JavaScript skills. It could go across a lot of different platforms, but the user experience isn't going to be, it'll be good, but it's not going to be as good as, having a 100% native. Now we get up to HTML5, where it doesn't run across quite as many platforms, but it's going to give your users a better user experience. It'll have, a few more things like, local storage and session storage, which gives you some advantages over HTML4. So the app is going to be a little more responsive. It might be able to work offline, and, you're just going to get a better user experience. But then you're starting to see the the breadth of devices that, is going to go down a little bit. Then you look at something like PhoneGap or Cordova, and that's going to give you, you're still going across a lot of different platforms. You're going to get a little better user experience because you're going to get access to more of the, native, file systems, more of the native functionality. So with HTML5, more and more, they just keep adding more and more functionality into HTML5 that gives you access to some of that same, functionality. So HTML5 and, things like Cordova are kind of like a horse race where, at any point in time, HTML5 might be, catching up a little more, and, things like Cordova might, be not adding quite as much value just because HTML5 is catching up so much. But then that'll give you a little better user experience. And then when you get at the top here, you're looking at things like Xcode, which is only going to work on iOS, but it gives your users a great user experience because it's, it's compiled for iOS. It's, not going through any kind of web view. It's, just going to give you a great user experience, but it's running on one platform. Android, same thing. You're going to be using native Java tools, compiling for the device. So you're going to get a great user experience. You're going to see, Android-looking tabs. You're going to see Android-looking UI elements. And it's just going to run better because it's compiled for the OS. It's running right on the OS. And that's what, and so after you kind of get all this in context, that's where you can kind of see where Titanium, adds some value, because with one code base, you can basically run across Xcode and, Java and Android, using an existing skill set of JavaScript, getting things, running. It's going to produce a native Xcode project. It's going to produce a native Java. So you have all those, UX advantages of, a very responsive UI design, very responsive screens as you're going from one screen to another. But then you're not limited to one code base, that only runs on one platform. Now you have one code base that runs across both platforms. So keeping all that UX consideration in mind, that just kind of shows where, the advantage Titanium brings, to that. All right, and there is going to be, just, this isn't going to be just a huge slideshow. We are going to have a demo of a Titanium Studio. It's just, I think it's good to put some of this in context. PhoneGap and Titanium. And I just like to spend a few minutes talking about PhoneGap/Cordova and Titanium, because I think there's a fair amount of confusion. Whenever I talk to people about Titanium and mention, okay, it uses JavaScript, they immediately jump to a web view and thinking, okay, it's just like, Cordova, it's just a web view. Then they start asking questions like, well, how do you, where do you put the CSS in? Where do you put the HTML in? And, the short answer is you don't. It's, PhoneGap uses JavaScript in a, very web-oriented way. And Titanium uses JavaScript, but it doesn't interact with a web page at all. I mean, with Titanium, you can create a native, web view, to display a web page, but that's not the core way, that Titanium runs an app. Right, so Titanium runs an app as well, but uses, 100% native controls to present the UI components instead of having to use, HTML5, CSS, kind of reinventing UI controls. It just, uses native UI controls on iOS and native UI controls on Android, just from that one JavaScript framework. But like I was saying, just to kind of reiterate, PhoneGap uses JavaScript talking, in a very web way, and Titanium still uses JavaScript, but it, communicates to the native app using, Titanium's API and, and the proxy objects that I'll be talking about in a minute here. Right, this is kind of what I was alluding to before. One language, two dialects. Both Cordova and Titanium use JavaScript, but it's two different dialects, two different contexts. It's kind of like I can be speaking one language. I can be speaking to a doctor about a circulatory system in English, and I can be talking to my auto mechanic about the engine and a fuel pump and how the coolant system works in English. I mean, so we're using the same language, but we're using, you know, the conversation is completely different context. So, I mean, that's kind of this similar thing what's going on here is, you know, Cordova uses JavaScript to talk to the DOM of the web view. You know, that's kind of the central way that it uses to run the app. And, you know, Titanium uses its own API to talk to proxy objects that, you know, manipulate the native UI controls, you know, and just get the app working. Main thing to take away is that, you know, they both use JavaScript, but it's not, you know, it's not a web-oriented JavaScript in both cases. All right, and you know, Cordova is a container. It's a hosting a web view, you know, for the JavaScript that runs the app. You know, Titanium is more of an environment inside of which your app runs. You know, so Titanium Studio, which, you know, you'll see in a few minutes, it's, you know, it really kind of hides, you know, that Xcode is even doing the work. I mean, the way Titanium creates an app is you'll make your app in Titanium Studio, then it, you know, uses Xcode behind the scenes to create the native app. But, you know, after you've been using it for a while, you don't even realize that that Xcode component is there. But with Cordova, it's, you know, you're always working, you know, if you need to modify how Cordova works, then a lot of times you need to get into PhoneGap or get into the Xcode versions of it. So you're dealing a little more directly with Xcode there, whereas with Titanium, it's, you know, a little more behind the scenes. Right, so this is the last slide before the demo, but just kind of, you know, some differences, but, you know, between Titanium and like Cordova. You know, with Titanium, you've got your JavaScript code, which, you know, creates a proxy object. So the way Titanium works is that, you know, you've got kind of a, if you want to create a button, you've got some JavaScript code to kind of create that button. So then you've got a JavaScript object, but then that JavaScript object talks, you know, in Objective-C to create kind of a parallel proxy object in native iOS. So now you've got this proxy object and, you know, JavaScript, you know, that's kind of hooked up to this proxy object, and or it goes to the native object in iOS. So then anything you do on the JavaScript, you know, object will kind of be reflected in native, you know, and any events that fire on the native object will be represented in JavaScript. And, you know, Cordova is just completely different than that, even though even on the chart here, it looks kind of a similar structure, but, you know, you've got JavaScript code in Cordova that, you know, runs in a web view, uses a very, you know, web-oriented JavaScript to talk to the DOM and make things happen in this embedded web view. And, you know, the only native part about this is, you know, when the web view is running. So that's the presentation. Let me start trying to do a screen share here, and we'll get, you know, seeing Titanium Studio for you. All right, so this is Titanium Studio. You know, even when I first started working with Titanium, it was, you know, this is a big improvement over the tools that were available when Titanium first came out. So it's, you know, it's nice to have a good environment to debug and, you know, develop the apps. But looking at the code, this is just a good example of how using JavaScript is, you know, completely different. I mean, the first thing you can notice is that, you know, the JavaScript use in Titanium is completely different than something, you know, like Cordova, where, you know, you're going to have HTML tags and divs and spans, you know, with Cordova. But with Titanium, you've got, you know, a lot more, you know, object-oriented kind of an approach. You know, you can still reuse a lot of your JavaScript skills, but then you just need to learn, you know, the Titanium API. So an example of that API is, and just so you know, if you see TI, that's just short for Titanium, because normally you'd have to do, or when you might get started, you might say, all right, Titanium UI.create tab group, But you only have to type out titanium about 10 or 15 times before you realize that I don't want to type that a whole lot. So TI is just a shortcut for titanium and any kind of namespace references. So we've got, and this is a great example of how easy it is to create a native control. You basically just say, the JavaScript variable that you want to assign the proxy object to, and then you just call the method off the API to create a tab group. I mean, it's really that easy. And just a couple things about why I've got this code set up this way is that, when there's event handlers in Titanium, sometimes it's, if you would just say when I would first get started with Titanium, I'd say something like tab group equals Titanium UI create tab group. And the only kind of side effect of that is that when you're in an event handler, sometimes you might have trouble getting access to this JavaScript object. But after I ran into that problem a few times, I realized that, okay, this is, it's good to have kind of a fully qualified name within, your own application namespace, so that if you're up in this button click event and you want to get access to the tab, then you can just say, app.tabgroup, and then just get very easy access to it. So you're just giving it more of a fully qualified, name now instead of, kind of a locally defined JavaScript variable. So we just walk through this real quick. You create the tab group, create a window, and then with the tab group, of course, you need some tabs, to go onto the tab group. But without, getting into too many details here, let's just see what this looks like in iOS. So what you can see is, in very short order, it fired up, went through Xcode, kind of compiled it into the simulator. So now what we're seeing is, this JavaScript code, running in an iOS app. And some good things to note that, there are iOS tabs, it's an iOS look and feel on the button. All the, you've got the, iOS virtual keyboard, everything that an iOS user is kind of expecting when they bring up an app. So it gives people, a familiar way to use an app, but also, it's just better performing. It's compiled for iOS. It's not running through any kind of a web view, and it's just a better performing app, and it's just going to have a better user experience. So now let's see what it looks like in Android too. And I just had this one kind of pre-fired up just because when you're starting an Android emulator for the first time, sometimes it does take a few minutes. But what we can see here is this is exactly the same code base. It's going through Titanium Studio. The only difference you have to do for iOS and Android is say, all right, I want to compile it for iOS. Now I want to compile it for Android. But you can see everything on, right, so with Android you're getting the Android keyboard, iOS you're getting the iOS keyboard. So without doing, any platform specific, tasks, you're getting a very native, look and feel on both, on both platforms. Like I said, it's better performing. It gives the user, a familiar, frame of context to use their apps in, and it's just makes better apps. But there are a few gotchas. You have to create, the Titanium apps, correctly. Just like with any tool, you can use it incorrectly or you can use it correctly. One of the biggest problems I had with going over to Android apps is that, with iOS, there might be different screen densities, but, iOS kind of shields you from that and kind of handles a lot of that in the OS. So if you're building an app for a Retina display versus non-Retina, there's not a whole lot of stuff you have to do in the code to make that look good across all the devices. With Android, it's a bigger, it's a different story, because with all the different screen densities, and there's not a lot of, things that Android platform does kind of automatically, except one thing that I'll talk about in a second. Because when I first did some iOS, Android apps, from Titanium, a lot of these dimensions would be kind of hard-coded, like 20 pixels or 300 pixels, and, it only took a few, running it on a few Android devices to see why that's a bad thing. And I think one of the biggest, Titanium handles a lot of the, differences between iOS and Android, kind of for you. But one thing that, over the years has just been pretty invaluable to me is when you're giving dimensions, using this DP, syntax instead of just straight pixels, really, really helps a lot. I mean, because what this is basically saying is it's, I've Googled, the exact definition of it and pasted it in here, but it's basically a density independent way of, expressing a measurement, kind of like an M and, doing web stuff, so you're basically just saying, all right, I want it to be 30 dp, and so that's, the top measurement. So what we're talking about here is creating this label. We're saying the top position should be 30 dp, and that just means that it's, 30, dps from the top. But the advantage of that is that when you run it here, it looks good, but then when you run it on a device that has a much higher, screen density, a much higher screen resolution, it's still going to be about the same physical distance from the top of the screen. So then you don't have to worry about, all right, come up with some calculation to say I'm working, this has this resolution, and, how many pixels does that need to be to keep it, say a quarter of an inch. Using, DP measurement just makes it a lot easier to let, the Android OS just kind of deal with that itself, and, just lets you concentrate on making, better apps. And so let's just, taking a look at, Titanium Studio in general, this TI app XML, this is just kind of a configuration file for the whole app. And it basically just gives you access to, a lot of the different properties that apply to the app, as a whole. Just the application ID, bundle that translates into the bundle ID in iOS, the publisher, copyright, and then with the Titanium SDK that you want to use. I mean, and this is really important because, as an example, when iOS 6 first came out, Appcelerator, released a new SDK to support all the new features in iOS 6, so you had to download that and then select the right SDK, based on, what version of iOS you were targeting. And then as new apps come out, as new, features come out in an OS, new SDKs are released to support, those features, and you just have to download it and select it here. Some of the deployment targets that you're looking at, because you can, even though Titanium Studio can, go across iPad, iPhone, Android, maybe all you want to do is target iPad, and then you can just deselect these, and it just, saves you a little bit of time in the build process. Another thing that's really cool about Titanium are modules, in that you can, download a module that would enable, say, barcode scanning. It's kind of hard to demonstrate that on the webcast, but you can basically, download some plugins. If you want to do some Facebook integration, it just gives you some easy methods to call, to do what might be a complicated task in a pretty easy way. So Titanium has a very clearly defined module structure so that you can download a module, plug it in, using this, user interface. Then with just a few JavaScript commands, you can, access some of the functionality in that module. And there's also Appcelerator has a marketplace for these modules, that if there's, some tasks that you need to do, on iOS and Android, it's maybe something that you don't want to take on, build something from scratch. A lot of times there's a module that could either, help make it a little easier, or, maybe just perform the task, completely within that module. So these are just a few of the ways that you can use to configure, your project, depending on what platform you're, targeting, what kind of SDK features you're looking to make use of, and just some things like that. So that's what I've got for the webcast. I don't know if we want to take some questions now, then this would probably be a good time for that.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Really fascinating presentation there, and we have many questions that have come in. So, folks, we will take them in the order they came in, and we'll take as many as we have time for. Okay. A lot of folks were asking, and I know you had a slide about it, but it looks like maybe they want just a little bit more detail on how does Titanium Appcelerator compare to PhoneGap or Cordova?
Right, right. I mean, that's a great question because I'm glad at least people are thinking about that and asking that question. And the answer is it's night and day. With Cordova, it's an embedded web app. You're using your JavaScript skills, but you're also using CSS3 and HTML5. Cordova's main way of working is you build your app using kind of mobile web technologies. Then Cordova then takes that web code, runs it within a web view that's within an app wrapper. So you can get access to some of the native functionality on the device that you might not be able to get with with just straight HTML and JavaScript, like access to the native file system. But you're still running within that embedded web view, within the app. That gives you a couple advantages, in that you can use a very familiar skill set to get an app into an app store. But then when someone downloads it and runs it, they can kind of see it looks a little more like web stuff than native UI stuff. Plus, when you're running through a web view, that's another layer that the code has to run through, to get to the native OS. So it's just going to run a little more slowly. Kind of comparing Titanium against that same kind of context. Titanium, you're still using JavaScript code. You're not going to use any HTML5 or CSS, but then that JavaScript code gets compiled into a native app using native controls. So it's going to it's going to give you a couple of advantages. You're going to be able to use native UI controls that people are used to on, whatever OS they're running on, and it's going to run faster. It's compiled to run directly on the OS instead of having to go through that web view. So it's going to run faster, and it's built, for that OS, so it's just going to give you that, enhanced user experience.
Thank you so much, John. We have a question from Reno who'd like to know, John, what is better for you, JavaScript or .NET? For me, it's JavaScript. I guess it kind of depends on, a couple things. And that's a good question. I think a lot of people would probably say, what's better, JavaScript or .NET? And I think, you got to weigh a couple things. I always say there's no one tool, that's going to do everything. That's why when you're out on a golf course, you've got a bag full of, individual clubs that are, tailored for a certain situation. Building any kind of app, is kind of similar, and, mobile apps are no exception. Depending on, you have to select a tool, to build the app. So I'm not saying Titanium is better than Cordova. I'm just saying that they have their differences, So, when you're selecting a tool, you have to figure out, all right, what is this app going to have to do? Do I have to get into an app store, or do I have to, is mobile web good enough? So kind of along those same lines, when you're thinking about, well, is, JavaScript better or is .NET better? You kind of have to look at who's going to be building the app. Because sometimes, the tool you select, might be influenced by, the skill set that you have in-house. If you've got a whole bunch of JavaScript developers and not a lot of .NET experience, then, Titanium, could help you take advantage of that skill set. If you've got a huge, .NET, army at your disposal, then even something like Xamarin, might make sense, because Xamarin is doing the same thing Titanium is doing. It's just doing it, letting you code in .NET instead of JavaScript. But I guess for a direct answer to the question, I think more in JavaScript than I think in .NET, so I just kind of, like using JavaScript better.
Great, thank you so much. Another question here. This one's from Earl. What about debugging tools? Can I use any JavaScript debugging tools, or does Titanium require its own tools?
Right. I mean, Titanium Studio has, some debugging capabilities built in. It allows you to, set some breakpoints, watch, the value of variables. So if you're going to be using Titanium Studio, your best bet is to use the Titanium, debugging tools. Things like, if you're used to using, Firebug or other, kind of web-based debugging tools for JavaScript, those, aren't, really as appropriate. But Titanium Studio does have some good debugging, tools built in.
Thank you. Bob would like to know, can we use the generated iOS or Android code natively after Titanium builds it, or are we stuck with Titanium?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, because the way Titanium works is that you put in your JavaScript code, you use Titanium Studio, and it generates an Xcode project for iOS. It generates, Android code for, Android. But that's totally generated code. And what you don't really want to do is take that generated code and start messing with it to achieve something, because then the next time you generate it, you're going to lose all those changes. That's where, so I guess the direct answer is if you're going to use Titanium Studio to generate the code, you're better off sticking with Titanium. If you're looking for ways to kind of get some of your own customized stuff in there using, Objective-C skills. Like I was talking about before, Titanium Studio does have or Titanium in general just has a really nice and a really clearly defined module structure where you can write your own modules, using, Objective-C on the iOS front and using Java, for Android. You can write your own modules that'll do, some functionality, at a native level, and then you could add those modules to your project, and that's a really good way to get, some native functionality into an app, that might not be there already. But yeah, if you would start, Titanium Studio does generate, say, a native Xcode project, but like I said, if you would make changes in there, and the next time you generate it, you're basically just going to lose all that.
Thank you. Dan would like to know if there are other bindings to the Titanium SDK like Ruby or Python?
From an app point of view, not really. I mean, it's more, JavaScript, unless they're working on something that I don't know about, or if there's something out there that I missed. Talking about some other languages, one thing, I mean, Node is a JavaScript tool that's pretty popular. And, Appcelerator, Appcelerator makes Titanium, but Appcelerator also hosts some services. I mean, about a year or so ago, they bought a company called CocoaFish that was designed to present web services, for a mobile app, to consume. That just made it real easy to get some web services up and running. And, they had some pre-built web services that provided some common functionality. So if you're looking for ways to use some popular JavaScript, technologies, I mean, they do allow you to kind of host a Node.js, application as one of those web services, that a mobile app can call. But in terms of the core, the code that you'd use to actually build the app, it's more straight JavaScript.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. Question from Srikant. What kind of apps can we develop using Appcelerator Titanium SDK? For example, there's an app called Summly for summarizing news. Can we develop such apps?
Yeah, and that's another good question. I mean, kind of the nature of Titanium is that you've got all these JavaScript objects, and you've got all these kind of parallel native objects. So you've got a native JavaScript button, that's kind of attached to this native iOS button, and they communicate over a JavaScript bridge, to make things happen on, either side. So a core part of, a Titanium app is the JavaScript components communicating, to the native components by going across that JavaScript bridge. But going across that JavaScript bridge has a cost to it in terms of app performance. So what you want to do is be able to, write your app so that you don't have to go across that JavaScript bridge more than you have to. So things like a really intense, 3D game, probably wouldn't be great for Titanium because you'd end up having to go back and forth across that JavaScript bridge, a lot more. But things about, what the question is about, I think, things like, just a news reader where, you're calling a web service, you want to present, the results and, some native UI controls, that's great for Titanium. That's, when there's not a really intense, UI, action happening, just things like calling web services, presenting that data in native UI controls, Titanium is a great way to do that.
Great, thank you very much. Joshua has a question. He says, I'm a web developer. What is the best way to get started with Titanium? Or what are some other good resources, and what are the costs?
Right. The good news is Titanium, Titanium, like every other company, has different versions of their product. The nice thing about Titanium is that, there's an open source version that's completely free to download. You can get Xcode for free, and you can get Android SDKs for free. The hard part about getting started with Titanium is getting everything set up. You have to download all these SDKs and configure them. If you don't have a Mac, you're going to, probably need to get a Mac to do the iOS stuff. But probably the biggest things you could do to help get yourself going, getting a Titanium Appcelerator up and running wouldn't be a bad resource to make use of. But Appcelerator does have a great, reference section on their website. Coming from a web developer coming to Titanium, the biggest challenge that's going to be there is learning the Titanium API. There's, when you're doing web stuff, you're used to divs and, spans and, all that kind of web stuff. So it's, very different, in Titanium, using the Titanium API to create buttons and get access to, the native functionality. So I would, aside from getting some, good books, go on to Appcelerator's website. They've got a really nice developer section and a really easy to use API, reference that has tons of detail on every API call that you could make.
Super. And just a couple more questions here as time starts winding down. Joshua asks, he says, I've seen simulators like the one we're seeing in Titanium. How does Titanium compare to the iPhone, iPad device simulators in Xcode? Is it just a picture with a window for the UI, or does it mimic native behavior?
No, yeah, another great question. The answer is that it's exactly the same thing. When you see something come up in the Titanium simulator, that's the exact same simulator that you're using when you're developing in Xcode because, behind the scenes, Titanium Studio takes your JavaScript code, it, runs it through its engine to convert that JavaScript code into something that Xcode can understand. And then it literally, uses the iOS simulator that comes from Apple to run that Titanium app in the iOS simulator. So, the answer is exactly the same thing. It's the exact same simulator that you'd get if you're running it in Xcode and hit the run button, or you're in Titanium and you hit the run button. So, it gives you a very true, representation of what your app's going to look like on a device.
And to follow up with that, Joshua just says, interesting. I guess that means I can cancel my Xcode membership, ?
Not really, because since Titanium does use Xcode, right? So I've got my own Apple developer account, and you need that if you're wanting to get apps into the App Store. So Titanium is still, it still uses, Xcode and kind of the life cycle of producing an app. So Titanium on its own can't produce, a native iOS app, but Titanium, produces,
churns your JavaScript code into kind of an Xcode project that you can then use to get stuff in the App Store. So it's still kind of a necessary part of the life cycle.
Thank you very much. Oh boy, a couple more questions coming in here. Folks now wanting to know about, let's see here, if they can use Backbone.js or other JS frameworks with Titanium.
Yeah. You can use a lot of different JavaScript frameworks. But you just have to kind of be aware of what's the intent of, the framework. Things like Twitter Bootstrap, that's a great framework to create websites really quickly, and it has a lot of nice UI controls kind of built into it. But that would certainly be something you wouldn't want to use, in Titanium, because Twitter Bootstrap is, it's got a lot of functionality in there to create UI components, and handle the UI aspects of things. But with Titanium, since it uses native UI controls, that wouldn't really, bring as much value. But if there's, for example, if there's a JavaScript routine or library that maybe, this is a simple example, but a JavaScript, library that you'd use to format dates, would be a great thing to use, in Titanium.
Thank you very much. Okay, just a couple more. Looks like folks have questions here. Jeff would like to know, can iOS external frameworks be imported as a module? If so, does that also go across the JavaScript bridge?
You could. What you'd end up having to do is write you couldn't just directly pull an iOS framework into Titanium. What you'd have to do is write an iOS module to kind of implement that, that iOS framework that you wanted to pull in. And in that module, you would write, some handlers to handle that, JavaScript, bridge, interaction. So a simple answer to the question, yeah, you're still going to have to go across that JavaScript bridge. And kind of on top of that, you're going to have to write your own module that would pull the iOS framework that you want to use into a module, and then just, kind of write your own JavaScript handlers there.
Thank you, John. And we'll take this final question from Joaquim, who's asking about local file storage consolidated across platforms, networking, sockets, etc. Which library level functionalities are coming with Titanium?
Right. In terms of, reading and writing files to the local file system, they've got some good functionality there. You can, open a file, read from a file. You can, manipulate, like blobs of data. Like if you use a Titanium API to capture a picture, you can write that out as binary data to the, file system. You can, in terms of socket connections, they do have, a library, to handle some socket functionality. So if you wanted to, write like a web server on the phone, you could write an app that would, open up a socket on a particular port and start listening for connections there. And then they've also got some really good just, kind of XML, HTTP kind of functionality. If you don't want to go quite at the socket layer, then you can say, here's a URL. I want to make a post, transaction. Here's some data, and that way you can do things in a little more, web familiar way, but still using, the native, network controls.
Super. John, thank you so much for presenting a really outstanding and fascinating webcast for us all today.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude our webcast today. Goodbye, everybody.